All right. 1 second. Oh, it always says, Mike, whenever we record it it says you have low storage, but then it always works.
Weird.
Because it records it locally.
Oh, I definitely do have low storage. I mean,
It's okay. It worked the other time, so I'm not worried.
Let's see.
Sweet. All right. We are here tonight on Left of the Projector. I'm your host, Evan, and we are going to be discussing the Hobbit trilogy based on, of course, the Hobbit. And we have a group of Tolkien Marxists to discuss this. Marxist Tolkeinists, I don't know, something like that. So I got Nick from Intervention Podcast, Mike from the Turn Leftist Podcast, and Hungry Rye from other episodes on Lord of the Rings.
Thank you all.
Thanks for having us, man.
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. And we did have another guest who unfortunately wasn't able to make it, had some things going on, but we'll hopefully get back with another episode on the Rings of Power in the future to bring you more Marxist Lord of the Rings content, because you need more of that in your life, I think. So I was thinking about this book, from a perspective of being like a kid's book. And I wondered everyone's sort of just memories of this book. And I wondered if this is actually everyone's like first gateway into ever reading Tolkien, because I feel like it probably is for most people, given it's a little more approachable. So I wonder what your thoughts, memories, whatever you got.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was absolutely that. I remember going to Barnes and Noble, and I think I said this on the podcast I did with Mike on like Tolkien from the left, just Tolkien generally. But my aunt and uncle took me to Barnes and Noble when I was 5, and they got me The Hobbit. And I just remember sitting in that chair, like reading it. And now I'm a 30-year-old man with a Lord of the Rings themed tattoo on my back. So here I am.
Hell yeah. I like that. Right, did you want to go?
Sure. I remember like the films coming out, like Lord of the Rings films, and then the Hobbit movies came out. I remember seeing them on, but I didn't know much about any of like the books or anything until like my young adult life. And I picked up The Hobbit and I started reading it, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is everything I could ever want in like a high fantasy book. And it was crazy that it's like so appealing to adults, and also it can be read by children. Like the audience of people that can consume this and enjoy it is wonderful to me. So I really like The Hobbit. It's my favorite piece of Tolkien's work that I have read like this far.
Yeah, I found The Hobbit after the movies and the original books. And I like The Hobbit a lot. I thought it was great as just like a standalone story. And then it was like only years later that I heard that they were going to make 3 movies out of it. And even before a single even trailer came out, I'm like, that just sounds cash grab to me. And I just was immediately disappointed. But I just love it as a story, and I think it really works well. And I could see, I was kind of disappointed when I found it as an adult that I hadn't read it as a kid, because it seems like a really good story to get at that age. But yeah, it's just great. And I think we'll get into that theme, that it's kind of disappointing what they did with the 3 movies, but
Yeah, I think those are all. So from my memory of the book, I had a copy when I was younger as a kid, but I didn't really get into it. I wasn't really as much into that kind of fantasy type of content. And then when I read it, maybe when I was older, and enjoyed it, but then I remember when the movies came out, years after that, thinking like, oh, this is going to be sweet. And then I saw like that it was actually going to be 3 movies. And I had seen all the Lord of the Rings on like opening night, when they came out, and was really enjoyed the first Hobbit movie, which I don't know what everyone, we'll talk about each of them. I actually really enjoyed the first one. I feel like it was pretty fun. And then it just continuously went downhill from there. Literally just to the waist, well, not great.
Yeah, I mean, well, the problem with the movies coming out is they did, and I think it was almost exactly 10 years after the Lord of the Rings trilogy came out, was just with how it was presented, it almost seemed like they really tried to replicate that experience of a family going to see the Lord of the Rings every year at the cinema around Christmas time. And it was all, a cash grab. I mean, I could have seen, and like we'll get into this more, I could have absolutely seen them stretching it out to kind of expand on some of the things, which some of the things I think they expanded on to make connections for people that hadn't read the books. I think they were well done and actually made a lot of sense. But to expand it into three-hour movies was just way too much for a 250-page kids book as an introduction to the world, really.
Yeah, they were definitely going for the same level of excitement and obviously profit as the original trilogy. Like, I don't know what they expected to get from the first one. They knew it was going to be popular. I think they just were, imagine if you were 10, 12 years old when the first one came out. Now you're, I don't know, 2022. I don't know. You'd still be into it. I still saw them in the theater. I didn't see the third one in the theater, though.
I say that as someone that did replicate all those things. I mean, as someone that got sucked into it, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
I did want to ask, like, since we're already talking about the whole cash grab aspect of it, is there a way that it could have been done right? Like, is there a way that you could have done? I mean, I guess the way would have been just to do one movie, but is there a way you could do 3 movies of The Hobbit and pack enough of the actual lore in there that it's justifiably 3 movies long? Like,
I think it would have been better as 2, like a duology.
100%.
Yeah. Yeah, like the fact that you had in the third movie, which we'll talk about, so much of it, just like even in the original trilogy, you had a lot of battle, content, battling and fighting. And you could have dialed that down by about 75% and had it be 2 movies, because that was all of the third movie. It was just fighting.
mm-hmm.
And to compare it to the Lord of the Rings off the bat, I think where it really benefited in that scenario, if you look at like the Two Towers or Pelennor Fields and Lord of the Rings, is that in the books, you've almost got 6 books in 3. And one follows, after the Fellowship of the Ring, the Two Towers and the Lord of the Rings, the first 2 books, so it would be book 3 and book 5, really follow Aragorn, Legolas, Merry, Pippin, right? And then 4 and 6 really follow Frodo and Sam, but that doesn't make sense in the context of a movie. So you're able to intersperse some of those battle scenes with really substantive things that are going on with Frodo and Sam and Gollum, right? Yeah. Whereas in this, it's like you can't really do that because it's all one story, the characters are all in the same place at the same time.
They tried, though, because they reached to having like Gandalf and other characters do other things that weren't actually happening, which we'll obviously get to. And yeah, so maybe before I don't know, were you about to say something, Ryan? I thought you looked like you were going to say something.
I can if you want. I wrote a whole spiel.
Well, no, please. Yes, I want to hear it.
I hope I don't mess this up, because it's a little bit.
No, please.
So I wrote, The Hobbit tells a whimsical and adventurous story of an quote-unquote everyday, although like petty bourgeois, person becoming an epic hero. Through his mentorship from Gandalf, he is able to overcome trials and tribulations throughout Middle-earth that hobbits didn't think that they could possibly ever rise to the occasion of. From trolls to dragons, we learn that anything is possible if you are willing to learn, grow, and even lean on your friends or community when you need help. That being said, in the age of late-stage capitalism and the constant pursuit to turn the arts into money-making machines, we see how a story of community and friendship and personal development can be bastardized into a story by sanitizing the broader message and hyper-focusing on selling action, gore, romance, all for the sake of profit to the masses. Yeah.
We could just end it here, guys.
Yeah.
No, it's a great way to summarize it. That was awesome.
Yeah. No, it is exactly. They less so. I feel like in the first trilogy, they didn't really lose the message, even if it was like slightly different. Whereas in this movie, they definitely did lose the message. It kind of lost its. I don't know. They took like a nice, like you said, like a nice kid story and turned it into like a love triangle, brought people back from the dead. They just, I don't know. Yeah, it's.
What sucks is that they actually really nailed some aspects of it. And those parts that they got extremely right got diluted by the things that they screwed up. Like, to bring up Bilbo, I think they really nailed the character of Bilbo. I thought Martin Freeman did an excellent job portraying it. He really encapsulated the character of somebody, like Rye, as you said, of like kind of finding themselves throughout this journey and finding themselves, you know, maybe to be better than they ever thought that they could be in the context of community. But I feel like even Bilbo's character, who, I mean, it's called The Hobbit, it's about him, gets kind of superseded by some of these other grander arcs that I feel like were really forced in this for, again, the sake of spectacle in the box office.
Yeah. Agreed. I think maybe before we talk about the first movie, I know that, you know, Ryan, you, Nick, both have a lot of knowledge on the lore. Kind of, maybe it's worth, without going, you know, into some detail, you know, kind of like maybe the context of some of the characters that we're going to see. Like the dwarves obviously are the bulk of the people in this both the bulk of the race that's involved in this quest, and then obviously they encounter the elves and there's the orcs. But I think it's maybe helpful to understand the context, because in the movie they really create a rivalry, a deep-seated hatred, actually, I think, between the dwarves and the elves, which is not present in the books. And I'm wondering how that actually played out in sort of pre-Hobbit history. And then feel free to also include anything about, you know, other characters, Neuromancer. I know you want to talk about Morgoth.
I mean, we don't have to go that far, but maybe we'll see where this comes up. And Rye, feel free to interject anywhere. But I mean, just in terms of like the conflict between the elves and the dwarves, I mean, one thing that you have to remember in the context of this, so like there's two different basically subsets of elves that appear in this, right? There's like the Elrond group, which in the lore are called like the Noldor, right? And then there's the Legolas, the Randuil sect, which are like the Sindar, right? And the dwarves historically, just as I'm going to really oversimplify things, they really got along historically with the Noldor, who are Elrond's people, because they were all like more craftsmen, right? And like there's deep historical ties there and everything like that. So that's why in the book I think that maybe it comes across more as indifference more than anything. And there was some events in the history that would have led to some conflict between the dwarves and Sindar, but they don't really even manifest themselves in the lore to the extent that they do, as in like, well, Thranduil didn't help us in the fight against Smaug. That is like kind of totally manufactured for the sake of building that plot line, especially as it manifests in the third movie and everything like that, right? So, you know, there's stuff that's there. There are conflicts in the history, but in the specific people that show up there, I think they really played on some kind of past historical events that were even different between these two people to kind of bring that about more than anything, right? And I think the other thing that you have to remember in the context of this whole story is that Tolkien had been building this world prior to The Hobbit was written in 1937, and he speaks about like starting to kind of formulate this world and what it looked like and some of the characters and themes even before World War One. So I don't even know when he started writing The Hobbit that it was necessarily intended to fit in this universe, but eventually he found a way to kind of make it work, which is why not everything is fleshed out as it possibly could be in the text. And they were able to draw on some of that in the movies because by the end of his life, there was some semblance of a finished product or a finished thought, which his son Christopher ultimately fleshed out. But ultimately, when Tolkien puts this out, there's a lot of vagaries, I think, even still in his mind, as to the entire backstory of The Hobbit and how it fit into his entire universe, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and I'll hear you.
Yeah, he took the lazy way out, or like Peter Jackson or Guillermo del Toro, whoever signed off at the beginning, because like the elves and the dwarves had always had like a sorry if it's windy, like a millennia long conflict since their creation, because the elves were created by the LOTR, which is like the ultimate creator, whereas dwarves were created by Aule. I'm gonna butcher that. I know that's not correct. But he was a lesser deity. He wasn't supposed to be creating anything. So they were always lesser. So there was always like that antagonism in that respect. But it wasn't what was in the films. And it felt like a very easy way to try to depict it. Like, oh, it almost like moralized them rather it being just part of their creation. I don't know.
Well,
Does
they
that
had to
make
create
sense?
they had to create antagonisms for a movie, and in some sense I get it, but at the other sense you could probably do it without that, right? Like especially if there was 2 movies instead of 3, which we can count how many times we say that to,
Like, there could have been like an extended edition where they talked about the history, like just a little segment where they just gave a little 5-minute spiel on like, oh, this is how we all came into being, but they just don't do that.
yeah.
And it's frustrating. But also with what you were saying about how like Tolkien hadn't like sussed everything out, like that's 100%, because the original copy of The Hobbit, in the chapter, what was it, with Smeagol, Riddles in the Dark, it was supposed to just be a gift. Like the ring is just supposed to be a magic ring. It wasn't going to be this evil ring that tied into Sauron. Sauron wasn't even like an idea while he was developing The Hobbit. So he had like reconcile these issues. That's why modern issues have that in there.
So how does that work
What
then?
else?
So how does that then work with like the necromancer? I said that wrong in my notes too.
Well, Tolkien
The
was a
necromancer,
really
like,
big. Oh, you're good. Keep talking.
no, I was just saying, like, how does that then fit in? Did he alter it later because it fit into the larger? Because you're saying
I
that
think
Sauron doesn't
so.
exist quite, right? But it is the same
Yeah.
character.
I think it's important to keep in mind that like Tolkien, when he was creating his like pseudo history or theology of like England, like his mythology, he pulled a lot from like Victorian and Edwardian storytelling, and necromancers have always had like a really interesting story behind them all, like depending on which necromancer story you reach from different regions in the world.
Right.
So I think he just pulled it and was like, oh yeah, sorcerer, like a Maya, like Mithrandir would be going and battling on his own adventure. And I think he found a really clever way of like tying it back in because he didn't have a body. So he's like, oh, he's gonna be a necromancer, like raising the dead, which like orcs were like zombie corpses. So it kind of like it worked out.
I mean, it's
that way.
cool as shit. So kudos. Were you gonna say something, Nick? I couldn't tell.
No, I think that's a good way to put it. I mean, I always just kind of interpreted it in that context, in the same way where I think he had an idea of maybe what to do with this character, knowing that he had this entire history behind him, but in that moment, he didn't know fully how to describe it. I mean, I don't think Sauron is referred to the necromancer at all, really, in The Lord of the Rings, maybe passingly so, but they're understood to be the same character. But I think that also plays into a little bit of the finding out what this entity is in The Hobbit, because even like Gandalf and Galadriel and Saruman and Elrond don't really know at the time. So it is kind of just like this vague evil entity. And I think that actually fits well with how this all plays out both in the movie and in the lore, where they're trying to suss out what this evil is. They have a little bit more to go on because they obviously know the history there, but that ambiguity, I think, is actually real in both cases.
Yeah. I mean, I think just the fact that this comes out after the Lord of the Rings trilogy, as often happens, I feel like they make the prequel after the success of the original. So there's obviously also all the tie-ins that they decided to do with characters from.
I felt so fan servicey to have that scene with the necromancer and have Saruman and Galadriel and Elrond and Gandalf all fighting at the same time. It doesn't fit well in the films. I don't know how you all feel about it, but it just felt awkward.
No, we'll definitely. I agree with that. Yeah, we'll get to the. Maybe we should talk. Maybe we should go into the first movie, and I'm sure we'll also talk about some of the aspects of it, and certainly we can talk about areas where there was inconsistencies or changes. But I think you said before, Nick, some of the things they hit pretty well. I think the first movie itself, in general, was pretty solid in terms of they lifted a lot of the dialogue straight from the text, like I think they did in the first one. And I was actually reread The Hobbit last week, so it was fresh in my mind. But I think that they set it up pretty nicely. So I don't know. I think the kind of the beginning of the first movie and Gandalf and the one thing I will say I did not like about the beginning of the first movie was having Frodo in it. I feel like that was stupid.
Yeah, I mean, aside from that, the first movie, I mean, even inclusive of that error, which I agree is an error and it's just like fan servicey to say, hey, look what we're doing here. Even inclusive of that, it's still the best movie in this movie trilogy.
Yeah, by far.
And I really think it does have to do with the character development. Some of the scenes that you see, like the dwarves coming into Bilbo's house at the beginning. I mean, that's all very spot on. How Bilbo acts in that situation, how he starts to build courage up, and even how he starts to find by the end of that movie that he has courage and he can do something in the context of like working with all these other people. I think makes a lot of sense and was actually pretty powerful in terms of looking at his character. But yeah, I mean, it's far and away most accurate and the best. And I think those things aren't unrelated.
Yeah, that's true. It is accurate. Now, I wondered this too, because I was trying to think about intentionally, like thinking about the first movie and some of the, like you think of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, you think of like the ultimate quest, which is, in an oversimplification, is to destroy the ring. Whereas in The Hobbit, they do slightly alter like the concept of what their quest is between the book and the movie. I wonder if you think that's the case, and if because the idea for just sketching out some of the plot is, Gandalf goes to see Bilbo because he's going to be using his house as a meeting point for a number of dwarves, including Thorin, Oakenshield, who's going to be is basically the king or leader of the dwarves, and now is going to use him as this burglar person. It's not really defined early on what that really means exactly, to essentially go get all the gold that's in their own home in the Lily Mountains that is now being watched by a dragon of smog. I feel like in the book they didn't really bring out further depth to that story of actually like regaining kind of like their title and their kind of their glory. That's kind of added in the movie, but maybe it's for the best because it kind of makes the quest more grand. I don't know what you guys think.
It is playing again into like those themes of like to restore the kingdom is to restore peace. Like we saw like throughout the Lord of the Rings trilogy with like Aragorn becoming like the king of Gondor again. But this is like Thorin's like quest to be able to reclaim what was stolen from them, because Smog is essentially like a capitalist and he stole all their surplus value that they had to work so hard to create. So they are unionizing and getting back what the fruits of their labor. That is my reach for the night.
Oh yeah.
I mean, that's in line with my reach for this too, because I really struggle with a lot of Marxist themes to bring out of this movie and out of this text. Because again, and I think part of what you're saying, Evan, with your like initial posing of the question is the book is kind of vague, and it's okay when you're a kid reading it, and it's fine. Just like, oh yeah, they're going on a quest to reclaim gold and kill a dragon. Fucking sick. Sign me up. This is awesome. But it is really kind of vaguely defined. And I reread the book again for probably like the 7th time recently as well. And I do think in the sense of if you're going to make a big movie about it, it makes sense to kind of add a little bit more impetus to it. And then to just build off of Rye's point, I mean, my stretch was that is like Smog the imperialist and Thorin almost like the national bourgeoisie who we critically support in terms of reclaiming the nation's wealth, you know? So like that's my reach.
I mean, I think, yeah, I
You
mean,
both be right. We're reaching here. Like, why
I mean,
not?
Right, yeah.
they're not that dissimilar from each other, both of those kind of Marxist spins on it. But I think it makes it I think it makes it a better movie than just like to reclaim gold,
Yeah.
just to get the treasure. Like that would be. I also kind of question whether this trilogy was really built as like a kids movie, because I really don't think it was. Like if kids want to watch The Hobbit, they can watch that cartoon that came out, in what, the 70s. I don't feel like this was really a kids adaptation of The Hobbit.
But they seem to want it both ways because they did some like campy kid shit. They made things a little bit more cartoonish than The Lord of the Rings, but they also tried to introduce more serious elements. And it seemed like they wanted to do both and they kind of accomplished neither. They didn't make it as like gritty and serious as The Lord of the Rings, but they also didn't make it just a simple kid's story either.
That's true. Yeah. And I forgot to mention this because I think you mentioned it. I don't know who, maybe Rye mentioned it. Just as an aside for anyone who doesn't know, Guillermo del Toro was supposed to direct this trilogy. He spent 2 years developing it in pre-production, and then Warner Brothers was apparently like hurting financially, and he had to drop out. And that's when Jackson came in and, on his on Shadowfax to save the day, because they needed someone to write this. They needed someone who knew Lord of the Rings, could make these movies. And I think that probably that switch probably had a lot to do with the muddled message of it being like a kids movie. Because I have a feeling that Del Toro would have made it a little bit more kids-ish. I don't know. I think of like Pinocchio being a kids movie, but also having like adult themes, or other movies he's done like that. So
Yeah, he made like Pan's Labyrinth and some other like spooky, scary movies, and they had like the what is it? I can't think of what his name is. The one that like filmed the Labyrinth, like the real effects, and it does appeals to kids, but also it's really scary, so adults can also watch it. So I think there would have been a lot more themes like that, not just CG orcs or goblins.
yeah, I think that's what happened. They had spent so much money probably already that I'm sure the CGI to make orcs was cheaper than all of whatever they'd have to do. And it just kind of felt cheesy. Less so in the first movie. I think the first movie is fun. And I don't know. We don't have to like go through the entire, plot of the first film. But I think the setup, as we already kind of talked about, as what they turned the quest into, how it's now kind of a reclaiming your homeland kind of situation. And you kind of see everyone is really like the camaraderie early on is very strong. And Bilbo is starting to kind of gain some courage, as you said, Nick. And I think you really don't see that much deviation from the book. Like there's little bits of like, you could be really nitpicky. Like a Hobbit would, in the movie, he runs out of his house with his backpack on, but in the book, he's got nothing on him, which is like super un-Hobbit. Like he's like naked, basically, no hat, nothing, which I think is pretty funny in the book, actually.
I think one of the more important aspects that they changed was who tricked the trolls. Bert,
Yes, I
Tom,
wrote that
and
down.
William. And I think that's a really important aspect to like, I don't know, like explore like why they made the executive decision to like make it Bilbo and not Gandalf like mentoring him on like the riddles of the way, like how you're gonna have to outsmart your enemies as you progress through this quest.
Well, go ahead, Nick. I have a theory on that too.
No, I was just going to say, agreed that it is a big change, but I also didn't hate that one as much because it kind of gives you that character development in bits of Bilbo that you don't necessarily get, where he's obviously in a bad situation, and he starts to think on his feet a little bit, because you really don't see that until we get to the golem scene, which I do want to touch on a little bit in the book. But it's a change. It's one that I didn't hate.
Yeah, I didn't necessarily hate it, but I feel like the value in making that change was to almost like make Bilbo's kind of character develop more quickly. Like in the book, I feel like it took him much longer to really be
100%.
courageous, whereas in the movie they needed him to have that in the first movie, because there's 6 more hours of content that they're gonna.
Yeah, we're like an hour and a half in already. We got to see something,
Right, and they do. It's like in the like you said, in the book, he doesn't really have any part of it. He's not stalling for time. The whole thing. He's not telling them how to cook.
And we're 40
wars.
pages into the book at this point.
Right, exactly. And there's an hour of content maybe. They spent a lot of time in the Hobbit hole in the Shire early on in the movie, but Gandalf does in the both, like, he's the one who kind of arrives at the nick of time for like the sunlight to kills the trolls, turns them to stone. And they also did change a little bit of the, like, when they find the swords in the cave where the trolls lived. I feel like they altered that a little bit, but it was very minor. Like, I'm trying to remember what the exact thing that they changed, but it wasn't very. I'm nitpicking on it, maybe. But I think it's when after the trolls, I think is when we do start to see some changes, and they talk to. Is it at this point in the book or in the movie? Does Thorin give a story about Azog the Defiler? Because I know there's a scene in the movie where they kind of show like the recreation of the battle. Is that at this point?
Yeah, I think it's after that, when basically Azog is introduced, and Thorin kind of gives that, or I think it's Balin talking about why Thorin is so driven and who his nemesis might be, right? Because then we get like the chase scene going into Rivendell, which didn't exist in the books, and everything like that. But this gets into, I think, really playing into the Thorin character. And I think it really is trying to replicate like this quest, as you guys already alluded to, of like trying to make Thorin essentially like the new Aragorn.
Yeah.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. But sorry, you're not Aragorn, buddy.
No, and the thing is, Thorin is a cool character in his own right, but like he's an older, wiser dwarf in the books with his own like cool history. He doesn't have to be Aragorn, but
and he had no beard.
For moviegoer, yeah, like he's old in the books. It drives me freaking crazy. It really does.
Yeah, I saw something saying like, why does he has no beard?
Why is Thorin sexy? Come on, guys.
Yeah. Well, I know why. for the appeals of the viewers. But so maybe we should mention, since you mentioned, or I guess I brought up Azog the Defiler, is every movie needs a bad guy, because you don't have Sauron and you don't have Saruman in this trilogy, and there really isn't one other than just kind of the orcs themselves as a overall body. So they had to bring back someone from the dead. And so I don't know, maybe either you or Rye or Nick, you want to maybe give us a snippet on. Well, you can also agree that it's stupid that he's in this movie. I think it's stupid.
It is. It's annoying how big of a character he is. It's not just that he's in it, but that he is such a focal antagonist throughout the entire trilogy. It is very frustrating. It makes me mad.
Yeah. And the annoying thing is that Bolg, who also appears in the movies, is Azog's son. But Bolg is in the books, so you can just use him as the bad guy, even though like he only is mentioned very briefly in the books. But if you want to play something up, just use him. He's there because Azog is dead. and they show the scene where like they try to recapture Moria, right? Because the whole thing about this is that Durin's folk, which is Thorin's, ancestry and family lineage, they get driven out of Khazad-dûm, Moria, and ultimately found the Lonely Mountain, right? After they find the Balrog, which you see in The Lord of the Rings. So that scene that they're showing is them, fighting to recapture Moria after they've been driven out of that, right? But Azog dies there, and I think he's actually killed by Dane, who shows up in the Battle of the Five Armies or whatever it is, the entire third movie. So that guy's already dead, but his son still exists and he's mentioned in the book. So why do we need both of them?
Yeah.
It's just lazy.
We need someone for Legolas to kill, I guess.
Why is Legolas in it though?
That's another question, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, for the people who, I think again, that's like another, I think he doesn't appear to the second movie, but it's just kind of like also lazy. They want to just bring in more characters. This is where I also wonder how if these characters were only simply brought in to just link the two trilogies. I think that's what they spent a lot of time doing, was trying to link them for people, because they're 60 years apart, and obviously an elf can live forever, so they can have him in both. I don't know.
He somehow looks older in The Hobbit.
His eyes are really creepy in this.
Yeah. And like to that point, like where they're older, it does make sense that he's there, right? And Tolkien probably hadn't conceptualized Legolas yet because he hadn't written Lord of the Rings. But if you want to do a fan service thing, have him make an appearance in, when they're outside, when they're in the prison cells in the halls of the Woodland Realm. And then that's it. Do your little like shitty fan service thing and then move on. He doesn't need to have his own story arc.
Well, we'll talk about that with the second movie. Is they had to. What's a movie without a love triangle? But this is sort of where you also get in this first movie. I think it was maybe it's only a mention, maybe it's not in it, but you learn a little bit about the five wizards, which I think was kind of a decent service to people, is learning a little bit out, because most people don't really know anyone beyond Gandalf and Saruman. So it was cool to have Radagast in it, even though I don't know, it was like that quirky little character that they had to have in it because it's like that's a kid edition.
Comedic relief.
Yeah, so we could see all the bird shit on his head. under his hat.
I mean, he was a funny character. Like, he added a lot of fun to that movie, to be fair. But yeah, I mean, definitely a kid edition for sure.
Which I'm not like mad at that, I guess.
I just wish they would take the opportunity, like if they're going to invent shit, just talk about the Blue Wizards. Why not? There's nothing about them. Like, you have creative free range to do whatever you want with them, and nobody can get mad. Just kill them, make them something cool if you're in your films, if you want to like add action or something. I don't know.
Yeah. You heard it here, Amazon. Enlist us, pay us money, and we'll write your friggin' Blue Wizard spinoff.
I mean, what I want to see is just a show, like a movie about just like individual. I think I don't know maybe I told you all this. It would be really cool to see a show that kind of just focused on one race, just like one part of the elves, or one kingdom within them, and just kind of have it be that kind of thing. And just, I know they like to have it be very expansive across all of Middle Earth. These world, it's a pretty awesome world, so why not have lots of it? But it'd be really cool to kind of focus it in on a smaller. That's my plug of it's not really a plug, just my opinion.
I was trying to relate it in a more mainstream way, and I was just thinking it would have just been better if Peter Jackson could have somehow blown people out of the water by making The Hobbit in 2000, and then they gave him the cash to make the real Lord of the Rings movies, but the way that they should be made, by extending those into even 3 movies apiece. Like, make a whole fucking series of 9 if you want. Like, people would enjoyed that. Like, you can include Tom Bombadil for God's sakes, like please.
Mike's big on Tom Bombadil.
I love Tom
We
Bombadil.
got to
Man.
get Tom Bombadil and Goldberry in there.
He's an essential character.
I love him.
You know what? I just realized. I don't feel like we. This is a disservice to those, to our 3 previous episodes on the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I don't think we talked about him that much in his omission, and we have omitted the omission from our previous episodes.
Oh no!
So plug for me and Mike's episode on Tolkien, because we talked a little bit about Tom Bombadil there.
You did, and I remember hearing that, being like, "Shit, we didn't do we didn't get into that enough." There's so much to talk about in all those movies that it's tough.
That meme that you sent in the group chat about this is just a perfect encapsulation of why it's so disappointing. Is because there's so much material to cover, and then having, I mean, I guess to describe it again, it's just to say that there are 3 movies of the huge 3 Lord of the Rings books, and then 3 movies of this tiny Hobbit book. It's like, yeah, there's so much material to pull from, and then to have done this thing where you have to insert things where they don't belong, it's just awkward.
I mean, you could have had a season on each of the 3. Like they made what, 10 hours on each of the Game of Thrones books, right? Like 10 episodes. You could have had 10 episodes of an hour each on each of the Lord of the Rings movies easily.
Easy.
You could have had 2 seasons. Yeah, you could have just made them until the actors are too old. I don't know. Like Legolas is in this movie. The other thing too that I noted down just as a thing that was different, because we're talking about they kind of switch up. This is again like maybe a little of a nitpick. They switch up where Gandalf gets the key, like from, is it from Thrain?
Yeah, Thorin's dad.
Don't they kind of change around like where, like they kind of insinuate that he got it from him before beforehand, but then why does he then go to meet him again?
Well, they don't want to answer that question, because the reality is in the lore, Gandalf had already done that,
Right.
and had his suspicions almost confirmed that the necromancer was Sauron, right? And then he meets Thorin in Bree later on, gives him the map and the key, and then we kind of proceed from there. But that really plays into the entire motivations from Gandalf's perspective for this quest to begin with, which really, in fairness, aren't fleshed out at all in The Hobbit. And you have to kind of get that from the appendices of the Lord of the Rings, which
That's
is a lot
actually,
to ask, but
that's what I was actually curious what you thought of. Like, what is I mean, again, because he only has kind of an inkling of who the necromancer is and this quest and kind of the importance of reclaiming. That's why I think it actually makes sense to be more than just a gold, like a cash grab, literally for the dwarves to get their gold back. It makes a lot more sense to reclaim and kill Smaug because of the fear of the necromancer. I think that's what you told me. You said like, well, what if he had control of Smaug?
Well, and that was kind of Gandalf's thinking in the whole thing, was that in the grand scheme of what Gandalf saw coming of Sauron coming back, he, again, as you can read in the appendices and other things, he saw the danger of, once Sauron's war kind of broke out, of him using the dragon Smaug to basically desolate Lorien or Lake Town, Thranduil and all that. So he was kind of moving this on a good hunch, almost preemptively, to kind of remove Smaug from that picture. And like, you have to remember that Smaug is inherently evil in the Tolkien verse, because the dragons are a product of Morgoth, which from the Silmarillion, which is, he was essentially Sauron's master, if that gives you an idea of how evil this guy is. So
Yeah.
I think it makes it more sense when you think of like Smaug being a Maya spirit, because he has like that much power, like the Balrogs and whatnot. Like they're all like on the same power level if we're doing like power scaling here.
Yeah. And that's a good point, because like we talked about, and Rye, you brought it up in the beginning, like the ability to create is that like Morgoth, not being Eru, who is essentially the god of the universe, has no power to create new life. He only has the power to manipulate, right? So the orcs are a manipulation. The Balrogs are a manipulation. The dragons are a manipulation of existing powerful life already, but just turned to evil purpose. So in Gandalf's mind, Smaug would have always been turned towards an evil purpose, given the history.
Yeah. As far as the like slightly getting back to the movie, I think you mentioned the chase into Rivendell. That's sort of how they fit in. Radagast was he kind of diverts them using his magical rabbits and such to, you know, chase them away so they can get into Rivendell, and that's where they kind of build up that little. That's why I thought it was useful to hear at the beginning how the elves and dwarves are actually, how they sort of feel about each other, because immediately when they get there, the dwarves are just kind of like, I don't want to be here. But and in the book, it's just they're like gladly willing to help them. They show them the writing on the map and the sun, the sunset and everything to give them the information they need. And I don't know. They also have Saruman coming to Rivendell too, and they have this little the little what's it called? The
council.
The council, which you don't get, but I think I don't know. I thought it was kind of nice.
I mean, yeah, it actually kind of does make sense if you're already showing or trying to show kind of like the grander scheming going on behind the scenes of this quest. That does make sense, because at that point, the council, which was Galadriel, Elrond, the wizards, would have suspected something going on in Dol Guldur with the necromancer Sauron at that point. So again, it does help to tie some of the threads together in the broader story in connecting this to Lord of the Rings, I think.
Yeah. I thought it was cool. They also have him like inspect the swords, and it's the sword of Mordor too. They kind of tie in little bits. Like I feel like there are times where Jackson did bring in nice little bits that kind of give things like more. Maybe it's just this first movie where he kind of did bring more stuff in, but there wasn't really any added characters other than Azog in the first movie. Everything was kind of as is, right? And then it's later on that as they start diverting more, as you said, Nick, that's when shit went south. And there's actually, go ahead.
Oh no, you're good. I was just gonna say, with like the way they constructed the films, because they like chose to keep one important thing, like big main event, happening in each film. But the first film, I think why it's so good is because it's the majority of the book. It's like the first 11 chapters. There's only 19 chapters. So like they had a lot of material to work from. They didn't need to like add any other characters. Whereas like the second one is only 3 chapters of the book, and then the last one is only like 3 or 4 chapters.
Yeah, the battle is like one paragraph, right? Isn't the Battle of Five Armies 2 pages?
Yeah,
in the book.
Gets knocked out.
Yeah, exactly. That's the point I made in the podcast with Mike that we did. It was just that, yeah, Tolkien doesn't really describe the battle at all. It's like Bilbo gets knocked on the head and gets told in retrospect what happens. And it's really broad strokes. It's like where, yeah, the elves started fighting with the men and the dwarves, and then the eagles and Bjorn came and we won. And Thorin unfortunately died as well.
Yeah. Well, one quote that I wrote down that I thought was interesting. It was when they're during that council, Saruman says, he quote believes only great power can keep great evil in check. And I was thinking about this in the context, especially of like the second one and kind of what we know about Saruman at what his character becomes. And I felt like it was like, the note that I wrote down was like, democracy can't stop fascism, right? Like you can't stop this evil. Like great power does not actually stop evil. I don't know. Maybe my stretch of the day.
It's almost playing into like those anti-authoritarian, like anarchist type tropes. I'm sorry if anarchists are watching this. This is just like my knowledge of it. And like, oh, like
You're
any
among
sort of,
friends,
like,
Rye.
like that anti-authoritarian, like George Orwellian type thought. That's what it reads like to me, and it wouldn't surprise me. If,
Totalitarianism.
like, yes, exactly.
Which is funny because in the Lord of the Rings universe, the best that the use of authority still happens. It's like you're gonna have a battle of some armies that's kind of authoritarian, but it's like that will still be backed up by, in the liberal mindset, it's supposed to be backed up by a democratic system, right? So it's justified in that sense. But in this scenario, what it's backed up by some kind of monarchy. It's going to be some kind of like feudal system at best. So the fact that that seems even more justifiable than just like, I don't know, what we would consider justifiable authoritarianism.
Yeah. Well, another thing too is one of the notes that I wrote down sort of as like a theme on this is that, I think you mentioned that he might have started this book around the time of World War I, or give or take around that period, is that it kind of shows the theme that like the victory of one group of another is necessary, but is the price of war and like human life worth it? And I feel like he has this very sense of Tolkien, kind of has a sense that like it's not necessarily worth it. I don't know.
I mean, Tolkien does have kind of like this Manichaean worldview, right? Of like there's good and bad, and what I mean when I say that is that it's kind of binary, right? And there's a lot of shades of gray, but I don't know. In our moment right now, I think there is some use for that, right? Like the working class is good, and there's a lot of like stripes in between there, and the capitalist class is bad. So I don't think it's bad to necessarily apply that, but that's an oversimplification.
Yeah.
No, you're right. He's like using his what is he? He's some type of, oh gosh, I cannot remember it. Augustinian Catholic, like he's very Christian, so like he's
Yeah.
attributing like that very polarizing good bad dynamic to politics,
Mm-hmm.
and so we see that a lot today, like in modern, like current contemporary issues. But then that leaks into his world building with that, and like the building and romanticizing of like monarchies as being like, oh, this good thing, you just gotta have the right leader in charge. And
Yeah, and that's all about it in like the Lord of the Rings with like whoever's going to lead, Gondor or whoever. Like if it's a good leader, the poor people will be like better. Or he doesn't really get into those things because I don't know that his view of those things would actually be ones we might even agree with. So maybe it's better he didn't.
It's a terrible thing to try to relate any Lord of the Rings stuff to politics in real life, especially because the enemy in Lord of the Rings is so clear cut. Like they're literally like not even the same species or anything. Like it's just like, but that's what ends up happening is if you try to relate it, like you're going to talk about people that your country is dehumanizing, or that your political compass group, like your ideology is dehumanizing, whatever. Like you can't really make that analogy to real life. But the way, like you were saying earlier, Evan, where he kind of asks the question of whether it's justified to use this level of force and whether what you're protecting is justifying it. It's like that is the liberal way to put it in a movie, is to ask the question, never really answer it in what do you call it, like theoretical terms, but then in this one instance where the bad guy is so clear cut and the good guys are so clear cut, we can definitely do it. And even if it's again backed up by a terrible system like monarchy or feudalism or whatever, it's still fine.
Yeah. We don't need to go through, like there's a lot also that kind of happens in there once they leave and they they're climbing through the mountains and which I thought was cool, like the what do they call it, the stone giants. I thought was kind of like another like kind of like kid-ish. I mean, it's in the books, it's maybe not as pronounced as it is in here, but this is when they're captured by the orcs and we have Gollum and Bilbo meeting and having their game of riddles. And I think, Nick, you mentioned something about that portion of it that you thought was worth I think you said there's a change that you didn't like. Did I get that right?
No. I mean, I just thought that this was in the context of the trilogies was one of the high points of the trilogies because
Okay,
of
yeah,
how true it was. And I just really, I don't even think there's anything worth, I mean, for me commenting on from like a theoretical or left perspective, it was just something that I really appreciated because of how well it was done to flesh out the Golem character, the origins of the ring in terms of Bilbo finding it and everything like that. I just thought it was something that was really well done.
One thing that a curiosity that I have in the it's in the scene right after the guessing game when Bilbo sort of like trapped behind. He puts on the ring and he's trapped. This is the first time he's put on the ring, I believe. And I wonder because they don't really, it's not implied in the movie, but I wrote down in my notes that this is sort of like the moment where like the necromancer maybe gains more power as you see in the next movie. Is he somehow have this sense, and this is a kind of a reach of like a sense of because again he didn't write the Hobbit knowing that this was like the one ring that's going to be in the Lord of the Rings, but it's sort of implied in my mind that the future Saruman is like now sensing this ring's power and maybe can become stronger because of it. And we can cut that part. I don't know.
No, that ring chose a different ring bearer because it's trying to get back to its owner. Because it's like a sentient being, kind of. Like it
Right.
fell off of Gollum, you know? So I think that's what that scene, what you mean. Like he's trying all he can to get his ring back.
Yes.
But it keeps falling into the hands of these hobbits who are just like inherently good beings. They don't have that kind of evil, I'm going to take over like humanity or the world in them.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the other thing that you have to remember is that Sauron's strength in this is still growing. So he's not going to be able to sense it to the extent that he is in the Lord of the Rings because he's not as strong as he is at that point either. At least that's what I have to kind of tell myself to make sense of, you know, Bilbo's frequent use of the ring at this point in time, whereas it's always a danger in the Lord of the Rings, you know?
Yeah, that's true. And so he then uses it again he meets up the rest of the rest of the dwarves escape, and they're, which actually I think also is a pretty cool little chase kind of moment in the end of the first movie. And this is when they're cornered in the top of the trees, and the eagles come. And I don't know why they felt the need for Gandalf to whisper to the butterfly to bring the eagles, because that doesn't happen in the books. And I was thinking, like,
Purely callback to the
Yeah,
fellowship.
that's the only reason, right?
Yeah.
okay, yeah, that's right.
Because he whispers to the moth when he's trapped by Saruman at the top of Orthanc, but it's purely another unneeded fan service.
Yeah, because I think in the book they just explain it as the eagle sort of knew something was going on and they kind of went to check it out, and they kind of knew Gandalf like kind of in passing, and they hate the orcs more, and so they're willing to help them.
They have their own agency, whereas like the way Peter Jackson depicts them is like they can just be controlled if Gandalf asks really nicely. They'll just do what he wants. But they're like a neutral force, I think, for the most part. But they know that if like Middle Earth were to come to an end, it would affect them. So they
Neutral good. Neutral good.
Yeah.
Which is why they couldn't just fly the fucking eagles to Mount Doom, y'all.
I was about to say that. I was like, are we gonna have to bring that up?
Yeah, no.
It wouldn't work, everyone.
But like how it really happened in the books was that the eagles have their eyries, their nests in the top of the mountains. They were still close to the top of the mountains, and Gandalf had actually removed an arrow from the Lord of the Eagles wing at one point in his life. So it was basically a favor for a favor.
Yeah. I think that's basically the end of the first movie. They kind of I think the very last scene is you see Smaug like opens his eyes, because you're like, okay, the next one's gonna be with Smaug, so we're gonna give a little foreshadowing.
Yeah, and one good thing though was that scene between Bilbo and Thorin to kind of flesh out Thorin's growing respect for Bilbo, because I think that actually does matter throughout the story, and it wasn't really fleshed out in the books as much, but I think that moment where Thorin says, "Look, I'm glad we brought you along," actually is good for Bilbo's character development and for people to buy into the fact that he is growing throughout this, you know?
Yeah, and it's funny you said that, because one of the notes I wrote is when they're, I think, in the cave, which is the entrance to the orcs. The orcs is he's really pissed at him, and he's like just being a real dick to Bilbo. Like he's really not respecting him, and then I think they did enough in that moment to show his courage again. Like he had shown it to them earlier with the trolls. Now he's showing it to him again. And now he actually considers him like a friend, which again, they build up all of the little kind of friendships. Bilbo barely has a friendship with Gandalf throughout the book, but they play it up in this because they can't just have them walking around. You know, they have to, they got to be doing something. But yeah. So that brings us to the second movie, which is The Desolation of Smaug. And the sort of the big early piece of this, I wrote down a line here. I don't know what the hell I was thinking, but I wrote down, is Erebor equivalent to land back?
So you're playing into my reach from the beginning, yeah?
Apparently, I didn't remember writing that note down. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. But we do get in this point, which is pretty accurate, I think, to the movie and the book, is the, you know, when they're, you know, they're running and they, what is it, burn? Is that how you pronounce it?
Beorn?
Beorn. And sort of that whole scene I thought was pretty funny, and they kind of altered it a little bit, but again, like a little comic-y relief of mishandling the signals, and Gandalf definitely being who he is, he's able to kind of talk his way through things. He's the voice here, and kind of convinces him to let them stay. Trying to look at my notes too. And this is before they get to Mirkwood, I believe, right? They're kind of, they spend a bunch of, not a bunch of time, but they spend this time here. They kind of get supplies and food, and they get their ponies to get to Mirkwood, and then that's when they all start tripping on the Mirkwood.
Yeah, like the utility of them going and visiting, like Bjorn, was to learn what they should not do in Mirkwood, like how to navigate it without dying. And then they still end up falling, well, because of like Bomber falling into the river. Although that doesn't happen in the films.
No. Well, the thing too that I was thinking too is, until this point, the dwarves really do seem to work as like a collective group, which is kind of like maybe equivalent, parallel to like the Fellowship early on in the first, in the not first trilogy, but in the trilogy. But they start to seem to like have, I don't know, they kind of have them kind of arguing with each other a little bit, because they're supposed to stay on the path, because if they go off the path, then, you know, things will go south, and they have that little, you know, issue. And again, this is where they also played up the spiders more. I feel like they altered like Bilbo's interactions with them. I don't remember exactly how it went down in the movie now. I was kind of watching that quickly, but he puts on the ring and he sees them hiding, and that's when like one of them like whispers to him too, right? Doesn't that happen in the book? The
Yeah,
spiders
he can
like,
hear the spiders of Mirkwood talking. Like that's what the ring allows him to be able to like
but
hear.
they talk in the black speech.
Yes,
Okay.
because they are like the grandchildren of Ungoliant, who is the mother of Shelob, and Shelob mothered them.
She loves little.
Fun facts.
I did not know that. Well, you know, I was just saying, Nick, we're kind of at they're kind of going through Mirkwood and having again another instance where, without Bilbo and the ring, really, it's sort of funny to me in the trilogy of Bilbo not wanting to even go, and now he's like an expert swordsman,
Yeah.
just killing things with his sword.
Well, it helps when you're invisible.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, I mean, and that in the book, I think, is like the first point where Bilbo really finds his own, because he's able to rescue all the dwarves from the webbings of the spiders and kill them, and they can't see him. And that's where the sword actually gets its name, Sting, because they're hearing them. I'm sorry if this was already said. I just stepped away for a moment, but the spiders called it Sting, right?
Yes, I know you didn't. I didn't mention that, but I wrote that down that it was called Sting. I mean, I thought that part was pretty good as far as in the second movie. I feel like it's soon after this when things start to take a turn for me as far as the movie and all of it. And I believe Gandalf is also not there during this part. He has left the group, which he likes to do. And this also takes me to one thing that I found annoying about the second and third movies is somehow in multiple instances, characters seem to be able to ride hundreds and hundreds of miles in like a day. So Middle Earth got tiny.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I know. This is kind of like it's one of the things in movies like this, I feel like you just have to accept. And it's
like in the book, Mirkwood is days and days. Like they're running out of water, they're
right.
hungry. But in the movies, they have to shorten it, and I understand that, but they shorten it like too much, or just seems like they're in and out. Like it's just a little path, little trail they're taking.
Yeah, it is true. It's 15 minutes, I feel like, at most.
I'm willing to accept Gandalf doing some of this stuff, because he's like one of the most powerful beings in the world. But like when you see Legolas and Tauriel, who I'm sure we're going to introduce here soon, riding essentially hundreds of miles north to get back and kind of do like a scouting mission and then still get back in time, that's where you lose me a little bit.
Yeah. It's funny. I wrote in my note too that I think when he rescues them, like they still don't know about the ring, obviously, and his ability to just kind of be invisible. I think he even says, "I found my courage," and it's funny. Like I didn't remember this, but I'm like, I bet he's going to say that right now, and he does say, it. I'm like, oh, of course he did. and then he also, like they mentioned, like he was staying on the path. And my note that I wrote down, another stretch, is I wrote that was like a metaphor for democracy and anti-authoritarianism. It's like staying on the path, like you can't deviate from sort of like the way that you're expected to do things because that's bad. Again, which we were just talking about, the anti-authoritarian Tolkien.
Yeah, I mean,
I can't hear you, Mike, for some reason.
Mike, you're muted. Or you were.
Oh, for some reason it says your mic isn't connected. No.
Try plugging it in, or like taking it out and plugging it back in.
It's the deep state coming after Mike.
I know that like audio on StreamYard can be funny. Like it makes you do silly, goofy things. Doesn't want to work.
He just wrote his mic was fucking up.
But yeah, I mean, it gets into, I guess, how you have to try to understand Tolkien, because Tolkien it sucks because like he's loved on the right as well, right? Which is why I kind of like to do this stuff. And I know we haven't been talking as explicitly about left-wing politics because I think it's a little bit harder with the Hobbit, and I think it more comes in. I think we kind of made a lot of the points about the movies, right? And how the movies just were bastardized as a result of capitalism. And that's an obvious, point that everybody should take to heart, right? Like, this is a good story. There's good kernels within this, but they did too much to try to make the movies. But to go back to your point about being on the path, it is important to remember, and I think I said this in my episode, it was like, Tolkien's like my favorite liberal, but he is a liberal, and it's about doing things right, the right way. But who's defining what the right way is, and that is defined by the status quo, the common sense around these things. And we have to challenge that, what that status quo and what the common sense around how to approach an issue is. It's like these billionaires dying in a sub. It's like, well, the nice thing to do is to, you shouldn't wish death on anybody or anything like that. And it's like, they're my class enemies. These people are Sauron, if I want to look at it in the Manichaean kind of sense right now,
I'm really sad they couldn't suffer for longer. Like, it just
Right,
really
yeah.
bums me out that they imploded.
I don't care. Yeah.
It's funny when this comes out, people will be like, I don't even remember. I don't even know what you're talking about anymore, because they'll
We're
find
onto
some
the
other...
new thing from 3 weeks ago. Like, come on.
Right, exactly. And then I think hopefully we can get Mike back in. So after they get through Mirkwood, this is when they arrive and they meet the elves again. And this is where I wrote down, like, Legolas is in the scene and this is stupid. Like, maybe I think what one of you said was it would have been cool if Legolas is in this, like, a little bit here, kind of.
Yeah, just give him
adds
a
a little
fan service
context.
shot, like a little cameo, whatever, I'm like, ooh, get a chair in the theater, right?
But I'm sure they do, like, these testing of audiences, and they're like, we want to see Legolas, like, shoot a bunch of arrows and killing stuff, and they're like, how much can we pay you?
Shield surfing and barrel riding and
And they're like, okay, we'll pay you to do that because people want to see it, and so fine, it's fine. And this is, like you said, Nick, they brought in Tauriel as this love interest for this love triangle. That apparently was a creation by Del Toro because he wanted to see more female characters in the trilogy or in the movies, which is understandable because they are lacking. But I hated it.
Yeah, and it's like, make her a strong standalone female badass, but like her character is so dependent upon like the love interest of like these two other strong guys who were also supposed to have, like, we're already supposed to be bought into. Although Legolas, sure, but like Feely or Keely, I can't remember which one of the twins that she ends up getting bought into. It's like, make her like, yeah, but like her character arc depends on like this other guy who is like Thorin's heir. He's Thorin's nephew, and if he dies, so he's already like kind of like de facto in the lineage, de facto strong, regal dwarf character. It's like, make her strong on her own merits. Like, why does she have to be in here as just the, badass warrior, but still dependent upon these other characters, these other male characters, if that's what you're trying to do?
Yeah.
And maybe I'll let Rye speak to that a little more because I'm a dude speaking to it.
But no, you're good. Wasn't the same with like her supposedly like marrying Legolas? Like, she was supposed to marry into it, so because he was supposed to be like the next in line as well. They always do that. I don't know why. It's just like an older story, and like it's one of those stigmas. Like, I'm glad the Rings of Power is taking it like a different approach, and they have like a really good like creative idea about like making Galadriel like a main character. I just feel like there's other characters in the Hobbit or Lord of the Rings universe that they could have used and given like, I don't know, storyline that didn't get it. Like, Arwen could have gotten a lot more storyline. I don't know why they didn't. She could have accompanied them. I don't know.
She was in a lot of the extended scenes, which they don't have in the theatrical, which is a bummer.
Yeah.
For Arwen, at least.
And it's also that like it's not that there's no precedence in Tolkien for strong female characters. Some of like the most powerful beings in the world are female characters. Like, if you go back in the lore, there's like Luthien, right? Who's like the daughter of one of the original elf lords from like the first age and a literal demigod, right? And that's who Tolkien basically modeled. Like Luthien is inscribed on his wife's gravestone. So like it's not that there's no precedence for his thought and his character creation behind making like a strong standalone female character who can be there on her own merits, you know?
Yeah.
Exactly that. It's the fact that they're like, oh, strong female character, but she's gonna have a love interest. Like she has to be like focused on chasing after some guy.
Yeah. There isn't a Tolkien. There isn't a Peter Jackson movie that passes. What do they have? I think there's that joke of when two female characters
The Bechdel test or whatever.
Yeah, Bechdel test in like their first trilogy, and it's like one moment for like 5 seconds. And so even in this, you know, she doesn't have any conversations with the other female elves. She doesn't talk to Galadriel. Well, I guess they're in different places. But yeah, and then the other thing too, so we don't have to, you know, I feel like we've hit that point of her character. They also changed the barrel scene of these two. I feel like they changed that completely. I feel like this is the point, and maybe this is like the first hour of the second movie, where really everything after this, like you said, Riley, there's only like what 3 chapters or 4 chapters of the book left, and they're just like, what are we gonna do? Let's start making things longer that should be shorter, and things shorter that should be longer. They changed the barrel scene. They also really expanded the Elven King Thranduil. Is that how you pronounce it? Thranduil? Something like that.
The hot one?
They really expanded his role
Lee
quite a
Pace.
bit.
Yeah.
Like he's barely in the book, and they extended his, you know, his character. There's a lot of that extension. And they in the book, it's supposed to be that the elves deliver the barrels, right, to but they don't do that. They have Bard do it. I don't know what you think about that. And it's just simply that they want to expand his character too.
I think that whole scene ultimately detracts from Bilbo's growing heroism and ingenuity, right? Because that whole thing is him basically living in invisibility in the Elven King's halls for like almost, I think it's like 2 weeks in the book, where he's trying to figure out a way to get the dwarves out of there. And he does wait for the elves to get drunk, steal the keys, release them, and then pack them into these barrels before they can get found out. And that is like one of Bilbo's moments where he kind of saves the quest. But instead, we have to turn this into this whole river, you know, floating down the river fight scene.
Because they needed
For spectacle.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's what they needed Legolas to shoot some orcs.
Right.
Yeah, I kind of hated that whole river scene. Like it was cool. Like, you know, I mean, but not even that cool. I don't know. That's like a movie spectacle type of thing where it adds action in a movie that didn't have any action in the book.
Yeah. And if your focus is in the right place, you don't need to have that from the beginning. And that's where they lost the thread from the beginning, because it's more on, and I would even argue this about like the Lord of the Rings, where like they still maintain the emphasis on relationships of people, even despite all the spectacle. It was still the relationships between the Fellowship, Frodo and Sam, that really, you know, rose to prominence, even with all these battle scenes going on. And it's like, this just feels like spectacle for spectacle's sake.
And they kind of sidetrack a lot of the relationships in the second movie until when they finally get into, you know, really inside of the mountain. I feel like they kind of don't have much of any interact. Like it would have been, I would have liked if they just kind of built relationships between the dwarves or something to get to Lake Town, something else. It had to just be this cool scene of them sneaking into Lake Town, you know, Bard kind of arguing his way through, and the capitalist, I don't remember the name of the little shithead who's like the master's like little puppet. what
They
the hell
focus
is
a
this?
lot on like the economics and politics of that little river or lake town, from
They
what I
did.
remember of the film. And I don't know why, because then like after like the desolation of smog and whatnot, then they have like a democracy or like parliamentarism.
Well,
Doesn't the
the
bard
the
become
master
a leader?
well the master of Lake Town talks about like, I mean, he's basically like the capitalist hoarding all the wealth, where all the people are like not starving, but they're not doing great, hoarding it. I think he even mentions how they're going to like stop the election in the town because they knew that Bard was really popular amongst the people, which he then, I think we said before, he becomes kind of like a leader later on after the plot of this book. I kind of like that little added bit in there, kind of with the politics of Lake Town. It's okay.
Like of all the things that they added that they didn't need to, that was one of the better ones.
Yeah, because it does show like this despotic ruler living in opulence, right? And even to the end, like he's trying to, and I mean, this is a parallel to almost every time some comprador leader has gotten overthrown. I mean, you think about like Batista in Cuba, like fleeing with all of Cuba's literal gold reserves and money, right, to Miami. And this guy's trying to do that, but he gets fucking squashed by Smaug, which is pretty cool. And
Yeah.
it doesn't happen like that in real life, unfortunately, more often than not.
It almost seemed like it almost seemed like they were trying to parallel his sort of control over Lake Town with like Smog's control over the mountain and the wealth. Like I felt like that was this one-to-one little nod that they were trying to create. I don't know. I just thought of
It
that just
felt
now.
like with Thorin going and reclaiming his crown and whatnot, like a Reaganomics type thing, like, oh, we're gonna get our wealth back and then it's gonna trickle down to the lake
Down the
town.
river,
You guys
literally
are
down the
doing good
river.
Yeah. We're gonna trickle some not the Arkenstone though.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wrote down in my notes that Lake Town was like the proletariat. You know, like they're this, you know, and they all show solidarity amongst each other, except for like against first they're like hate the dwarves and then they like them because they realize they're going to get them what they're owed from the dwarves.
Yeah, but even when like a lot of them are helping shield Bard because he is like the proletarian leader in the analysis that you guys are presenting, and I like it a lot. But there's some like elements of it that are paid off by the captain or whatever, right? Like I think Stephen Colbert makes like an appearance or something like that because he's like a big Lord of the Rings fan.
Oh,
He
really?
he like tips them off to like say that Bard is here, you know. But yeah, it does present some kind of like interesting interclass conflicts because everybody on Lake Town is suffering as a result of this shit. But some people like that gross Alfred character, I think his name is,
Alfred,
right? Like
yeah.
he's still gross and disgusting, but he's still like leeching off some of the benefits of the master's accumulation of wealth.
It's funny. My note that I wrote down when I was like, I don't know, I guess because I was kind of like, I don't like any of this, so I'm gonna like put politics into it. I wrote down that Lake Town was like you know one of the parts of the USSR that kind of got when it was, you know, dissolved, and it now is like run by like corrupt oligarchs taking across all of the wealth because that's basically what it was. It was kind of
It's
living
post
off
shock doctrine shit, right?
yes, exactly. I mean, it was living off of like the wealth of the dwarf. Like, go ahead.
Wait, no, because in your analogy here, all those people lived in Dale, right?
Correct.
Which was the human settlement, which was basically at the foothills of the Lonely Mountain. And that wealth was shared, right? Like kind of idealistically between the dwarves and the humans and everything like that. But they essentially got displaced and put into these like into this shanty town built on docks in the middle of this lake.
Yeah. It just felt like too here is they were building up also to create a furthering that sort of love triangle in here because they, you know, what happens to was it well which was the dwarf who is in the triangle? One
Keely.
of Healy, I think you're right. But they just really spent a lot of time building up the Lake Town narrative and Bard's history of Bard and the, almost killing the dragon the first time. And they're going to show you the, like the special arrow. I'm blanking on what it's called now, that they
The
can use
black arrow.
the black arrow they can use to pierce his like razor sharp or, armor basically. And they really played that up, and it was okay, but they needed to fill time because not that much happens until they get their way into again, because Bilbo is smart as shit and he figures out that they have to wait for the sunset, not the sunrise, right? And they get inside and Bilbo is now ready for his burglaring.
Yeah, but to your point, like, show those people's ownership of Dale as well prior, because like that whole like Lonely Mountain Dale kind of economy was kind of interdependent. Like those people worked together before, so like you could kind of set up that conflict better by diving into those people's ownership and displacement out of Dale as well. Like it shows the town getting burned, but like build up on that story to show why they might be invested in actually reclaiming some of that wealth later on in the third movie.
It just kind of showed it. It seemed like they had like sort of like the mob rule where they like, they see that they're going to go to the mountain and get their wealth, but they don't really show, to what you're saying, I think, is they don't really show their stake in it very much. They don't really show the connection. And that would have been pretty easy to show.
Yeah.
They just kind of.
I derailed what you were leading into, but I just
no, it's fine. I mean, this is basically just we now get the point where Bilbo has to go in and essentially find the Arkenstone, and I think this is part of also one of my favorite parts of this second movie is when Bilbo has his conversation with Smaug. Like it's pretty funny, I think it's a good scene, and he. It makes for a good moment in the movie, and he's suspicious of the ring too. Like he knows he has one of these rings, I think is what he alludes to when he's talking to Bilbo. And so I don't know. Another like kid fun aspect of the movie.
I think it also leads up, if I'm following what you're saying, like why Bilbo was chosen up until this point. Like he got through all of these riddles and whatnot. And I read this in the David Day book and it blew my mind. But like how Tolkien came up with Smaug's name, right? Was that it was a form of the Old English verb, which was Smeagol, which translates to subtle or crafty. And then also Smogan, which means penetrating, and then Smeagol with an asterisk over the A means like worming, or what does it say? Like worming into like a hole, like, which is why like Smeagol was, Smeagol. But it's like why Bilbo is like he likes riddles so much that in order to figure out how to defeat Smaug, he has to figure out what Smaug's name is to figure out what his weakness is. So through this process of Tolkien, he was a professor of like words, he came up with this whole like big circle idea where oh my god, Bilbo figured out that there was a scale, like a worming hole in his body, and then he sent word to Bard as to how to defeat him with the arrow. Like it wasn't something that Bard figured out on his own. I don't know if that makes any sense. The way I did not execute that well, but Tolkien came up with all of that, with like developing their names. So like Bilbo being a hobbit, liking riddles to be able to figure out the definition of Smaug's name to find his weakness. Some big brain shit.
I mean, that's pretty. I didn't know any of that or sort of put that together. That's great.
No, but what I do recall from that, and I didn't get into like the linguistics, so that's awesome, Rye. But there is a sense in that scene where Bilbo plays to Smaug's arrogance a bit, right? And his own knowledge. And that kind of opens up the opportunity for Bilbo to, I guess, in the films, find the Arkenstone, in the books more so to kind of see the weakness. And I think he is able to transmit it to the thrush, the raven, who is knocking on the door who actually
Yes.
communicates that knowledge to Bard. But it is this riddle game that kind of opens up the opportunity for Bilbo to give himself time to do either one of these things, right? And I think that is one of the things that they nailed in the movies, is just this conversation, right, between Smaug and Bilbo, because you really get that. And it also, in a slip up of Bilbo, is what keys Smaug in to the fact that he came from Lake Town, because he mentions himself, and this is something that is consistent between the books and the movies, as the barrel rider.
Yep.
Right. And he associates barrels coming from Mirkwood to Lake Town. And Smaug knows enough about the geography and the land around him to make that connection.
He does seem smart, even if he is arrogant.
Right.
Yeah. And there were sort of like these. One of the notes I wrote in this part of so this is almost at the end of the movie, I think. Yeah, it's when he's kind of released onto Lake Town, is the greed and I feel like the corruption that's kind of seeping into. This is also played up more in the movies, is of Thorin's greed. He's not really like sick like he is in the movie. It seems like they play it up of like the dragon, like the gold sickness. But I wrote down that sort of that Thorin is kind of corrupted by capitalism and power, and in his corruptive state, he then releases the dragon because of his own greed for what we kind of said is not really the goal of it, was really to reclaim his home, not the goal like it is in the movie, but because of that greed, it ends up killing a lot of people.
Yeah. And I think one thing to tie it into some of the conversations around the Lord of the Rings, and how we think that is maybe like a more like Sauron and the One Ring is more an explicit tie-in for fascism and the Ring, is that in the Hobbit movies, it's played up as the Arkenstone, as what drove like his grandfather mad and what ultimately drives him mad. But what it really is that Thror, his grandfather, had one of the 7 dwarf rings gifted by Sauron. And that was really more than anything which drove this desire to continue to accumulate wealth more than anything. Right. So it was like all this gold that was kind of accumulated in part because that at that time they possessed one of the rings that ultimately belonged to Sauron, who is like the ultimate capitalist imperialist at that time. And that's something I think that like where they put it on the Arkenstone doesn't feature prominently in the books at all.
No.
But
well, Bilbo does hide it from in the same way as they kind of fitted it in the movie, right? He hides it from Thorin. So
right. But in terms of like what actually causes Thorin to become kind of sick with this gold lust more than anything. Although the ring isn't there either, but that's where the ring more than the Arkenstone was the foundation. One of the dwarf rings was the foundation of all that wealth, more so than the Arkenstone.
Yeah, I think that's they it seems like they're trying to, like I thought mentioned, they kind of are kind of contrasting Smaug's hoarding of wealth and Lake Town's kind of master hoarding wealth. Now they have the Thorin hoarding wealth. It's sort of like their capitalist being at the top and having money will corrupt you no matter what. You can't be uncorrupted. That's not it's going to corrupt you. So,
no, I actually like the analysis much better when you introduce like occult objects. I think that's what you should do, is like have things like Arkenstones to prevent you from being corrupted or whatever, like, or if that's something that like, it doesn't matter however it works. Like you need occult objects because you can't have like a material analysis and just, this stuff frustrates me so much because it's where people get their political analysis, whether they realize it or not, because they don't have any kind of like ideas for how to, like, if you ask people, how do you stop people from getting corrupted by wealth? They'd say, oh, they just have to be accountable You just have to do it like local, like small businesses or whatever. It's like, okay, so you just admit your thing can't work at scale. It's like there are ways to do that at scale. You just have to have accountability at scale. But like when you can't imagine that because you inevitably arrive at communism, which is forbidden for us to even talk about, then you have to introduce occult objects. You have to introduce like all these weird thematic things. And that's why you get all these literally just occult people now we have in our society who believe in whether it's QAnon or New Agey stuff or whatever their pet solution is for all this stuff. It's like anything but communism, anything but the obvious solution. And I think that really relates well to every movie and pop culture object that we have for the solutions to what are the ills of society. It's like some kind of occult thing, some kind of weird spiritual solution that we can attribute to whatever our pet solution is in our real life too. Like because everybody could like attribute the Arkenstone to I don't know, like whatever QAnon theory you have as like a stone enthusiast in real life. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's easier than like thinking about class conflict as a whole. Just
Yeah.
focusing on one small aspect of it.
Well, and to your point, to both of your points, is that whether Tolkien knows it or not, what formulate the best societies, even in his vision, is when wealth is shared.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, I mean, we're talking about like even at the end where the elves partake, the dwarves partake all regionally, and all this wealth that's been accumulated by this dragon and the dwarves prior in the mountain. But like when everything kind of hits a point of like where everybody's happy is when that wealth is actually shared because everybody has done something to kind of generate and protect that wealth or take it back in this case, you know, and that extends to the Lord of the Rings as well.
Yeah. It like what you were saying reminded me of that article that came out where it was in the New York Times about oh well, it turns out that our economic system isn't actually that good after all. It
Who
doesn't
knew?
work. But in that article, like you said, they don't mention the word capitalism, they don't mention the word socialism. They just like have this like boogeyman economy is bad. They just kind of like create something out of thin air because they can't pinpoint it on one thing as the problem, because if they do, then people might be like, oh well, what's the alternative to capitalism? And that'd be bad for business.
It's sharing the wealth of the lonely mountain.
It just shows like how effective Red Scare propaganda and McCarthyism really have affected the masses, especially in like the United States, like where we cannot view anything beyond late stage capitalism and like our two-party system. Nobody can see past that.
It's just crony
Quite
capitalism.
frustrating.
It's just crony capitalism, guys. If it was just in the hands of some smart people. Speaking of capitalism, the third movie, which was Capitalist Cash Grab, again, this movie I just despise. I don't like it at all. It's too long. And I watched the extended edition, which is like an extra 20 minutes. That's how much I wanted to.
You're a brave soul. I salute you.
I don't know what the extended scenes were because I don't think I actually saw this one in the theater. This I think is the only of the 6 movies I didn't see. It sucks. The battle is forever. They just, they played up more about Thorin being sick from the gold and refusing to make a deal with the elves. I don't know. I don't know if anyone else wants to. Azog is really prominent in this movie. Hiding in his on the top of the mountain, which I'm blanking on the name of what it's called, where he's hiding, or not. He's not hiding really. He's just kind of setting their little trap. I don't know.
Well, I mean, it ultimately detracts from the main point of this whole sequence in the books. And the main thing is that Bilbo essentially takes the Arkenstone in order to protect his friends and make peace, right? And he's willing to give up his share of the wealth in order to do so. And the battle doesn't figure prominently in the overall narrative at all. It's just that action of Bilbo to say, hey, look, I'm willing to give up a 14th share of all the gold in this goddamn mountain to protect my friends first and foremost. And he does say that in the movie where he's like, why would you do when Bard and Thranduil ask him why he's doing this, and he's like, "Well, I'm not doing it for you. He's doing it to protect Thorin and his friends, right? But he's willing to give all that up to make peace." And I think that is the most important part, where it's like this self-sacrificing nature and heroic nature of Bilbo, which is the most important bit of this whole thing. And that gets completely, I mean, it is emphasized, but it gets completely washed away in this 2-hour unnecessary spectacle.
Just Legolas fighting, saving Toriel, and like there were some from like an action movie purely. If you're just looking at it from that entertainment value, I guess it's fine for people who just want to see that, but it's not interesting at all. And it made it worse that I was reading the book at the same time as I then watched this movie. I'm like, oh, this just makes me mad.
It feels like the battle scenes from Lord of the Rings without any of the stakes behind them.
Yes. That's yes. It feels like a useless battle where we already kind of know there isn't really any. Because Smaug is dead. The only thing that could have happened, I guess, is that the orcs control the Misty Mountain.
I think it's because they got rid of like the little solidarity bit towards the end, like before they were even fighting. From what I remember in the book, is that Thorin like changed his mind. It's like, okay, no, we can all like ally together to fight against this, all the goblin army and Bolg, or whatever his name is. But then in the movies, they were all separated. It was very like separationist. Everyone's fighting for their own good, like their own wills. There's a lot more solidarity in the books, and they took that away.
Yeah.
For the sake of selling action to the viewers.
Yeah. Apparently Thorin, like the 12 of them died, like not even 12. There's only, I think 10 of them there, all like rushing to battle, apparently turns the tide of the entire battle too. 10 dwarves. That tracks.
They're the 10 most badass though. That's why.
Yes. Yeah.
They're the expendables of the dwarves. I'm sorry.
And they also, we didn't even mention this too, but they also changed some of like the deaths, the way that some of them happen. I think they also changed how Thorin dies too, if I'm not mistaken. They just kind
of course, because Azog is not fucking there.
Right, of course. Yeah, I just kind of wrote like just the motives of the entire battle are not really like given to you either in the movie. I think it's maybe what you're saying, Mike, is that there's in the movies for the Lord of the Rings, the stakes of losing, whereas in this there is no. They don't even try and give you a reason. It's just like, we're going to fight now. I don't know.
Or at the very least, it's just not all of Middle Earth. It's not all of the race of men and elves and dwarves and all. It's like, maybe that town or whatever. It's like this gold at Smaug's, like whatever. It's like, it's small stakes, it's small beans.
I did like Thranduil's, what was it, like
the elk?
The elk was that was pretty cool.
Yeah.
That
was badass.
He like rides through and like cuts off all their heads at the same time.
No, I mean, yeah, there's a couple cool scenes and everything like that, but like the message is that everybody, Bilbo makes this sacrifice, everybody unites around like this greater evil, and then some people realize the error of their ways and they make good on that at the end. And Thorin dies in the book. Fili and Kili like die, like basically preventing his body from being mutilated by orcs, and that's how it goes.
I feel like they also changed sort of like the redemption arc of Thorin too, between the book and the movie. It's like a note that I wrote down. Now I'm trying to think if that's actually true.
I mean, the introduction of like Azog so prominently as like his main enemy really complicates it, but I don't think the broad strokes change so much. Like where he died after a change of heart, and he does repent with Bilbo, at the end of the book as well, in a very similar way. You know, it's a
Right.
different scene. It's a different scene. Like Bilbo wakes up after the battle is done, and he sees Thorin in like his like basically a medic tent. You know, I don't know that it changes his arc that much.
Yeah. Okay. One of the few notes that I wrote for the third movie, I wrote down, why does Toriel have to live? Like, why don't they just kill her? Like, what's the point? Like, just die. Because she doesn't,
Damn.
she's not in the next movie. So it would have been, I don't know. They didn't want to have her die. I wrote that. I also wrote, there was a quote, I don't remember who says it. I think it's Bilbo. He says, if more people valued home over gold, it would live in a merry place. Was it Bilbo who says that?
I think Gandalf.
Oh yeah, of course. He would say something like that. That makes more sense.
Oh no! I think Thorin says it on his deathbed.
Oh, you're right. You're right. As he's lying on the ice, he says that. You're right. Yeah, because I think it's when Bilbo has like a little moment with him before he dies.
Just gotta change human nature, bro.
Well, if all the orcs and elves and everyone had their needs met, they wouldn't have to value their.
No, we have to genocide the orcs. just
That's
joking.
a fact. No, they literally can't think for themselves. They are like only made to follow direction because they're like an abomination because they're not like true creation.
Yeah, I didn't know they were undead until you said that earlier in the episode, Rye. Thank you for that. I had no clue.
I'll have to like send like little charts in the books because it makes it make a lot more sense why they are the way they are. But you don't get any of that from like
Yeah.
the films, which is unfortunate.
I could be wrong. I don't know if they're like undead or they're just basically bastardizations of life. You know,
Yeah.
because the way like Tolkien describes it in a lot of things, and I think it touches on it in Lord of the Rings, is that they're like basically like tortured versions of the elves, but like Melkor could never create new life on its own. He just had to create like kind of twisted and mutilated versions of life. So they're not necessarily undead. I mean, again, I could be wrong in my understanding of it, but
Yeah, I think it's just where Tolkien pulled his inspiration from. Was
right with the
that
necromancer,
idea.
yeah, where it's like you're not creating new life, you're twisting something that's already
I mean, he was
existed
breeding
or
them,
was.
and like in the Lord of the Rings, like there's the scenes where he's basically breeding them, right, to create like
Rukai.
Yeah.
yeah.
That's also
but,
where
I
he
mean-
makes the trolls that you can see that don't die in the sunlight, which they don't really explain that why those trolls die in the sunlight, but the other ones don't die in the films when they go out in the sunlight.
That's a good point. They
Little
don't.
things.
Yeah.
Just doing a little eugenics, a little bit here and there.
That did always bother me, though. That's a good point. But I mean, ultimately, the orcs are, just brown shirts.
Yeah.
So not worth thinking about too much in terms of humanity.
Yeah. Yeah, they I guess they show Bilbo going home is the wait, we skipped over a bunch. It doesn't need to necessarily be mentioned. They show him going home with his little it's funny, they only show him going home with like a little chest of gold. Was that enough for him? Like he already was like somewhat wealthy, like you said petty bourgeoisie, whatever, Hobbit. But like is that little chest of gold, like is that all he got?
No.
Right? He gets a
He
whole
got
lot.
like a 13th of it, but I think he had like a bank. I'm assuming that banks were created at this time in like this weird like feudal mercantilist society, and he just like had a running debt with them because for his birthday party he was just like Amazon primed a bunch of gifts to give away. Like his money that he so that's always been mine. Or like people thought it was like hidden in his house because like in Underhill they thought he just like
Right.
hid it. I don't know. They never answered that.
I think the other bit of it was in the books was that, and this goes back to the first one where they find that troll cave where they found the swords. They also found some wealth there, and they had buried some of their wealth in that troll cave, and Bilbo hit it up on the way back. He did take a small chest, but he hit up some of that wealth in the troll cave on the way back too. But still, like, it is like implied in the lore that like, or in the books, that Bilbo was sitting on basically mountains full of wealth that you guys are talking
Right.
about, but it wasn't that much. And he was also like super free with his wealth, like, you know, as hobbits are, like they give gifts instead of receiving gifts, I think is the thing.
I mean,
But
mostly he was spending his money on, you know, food,
yeah,
like
on good
nice,
wine.
good wines, ales, cheeses, and the such.
Yeah, the good life.
Yeah.
Like a Hobbit QVC, like, oh, that looks good, because they like to collect things and keep it in their house. He had a bunch of shit to get rid of.
Yeah, I like how they show like all of like the Sackville Baggins. It's like auctioning off all his shit, stealing his like at the very last scene is them stealing all his stuff.
But like, whether you know, it's more explicit in Lord of the Rings than it is in the Hobbit. But like, you have to go out and fight evil in order to have that good fucking life.
True.
You have to face this shit, because like that stuff is maybe not like apparent to you at the moment, but like if Smaug runs wild ultimately and he's never killed or never dealt with, what happens to the Shire? You know, like you
Yeah.
need to go out and like you can't just, you know, live that good life forever. There are going to be existential threats to your way of life. And at some point you need to take action to protect that.
That is dead on. Like, but it is in the most tidy way. Whereas in you just take care of the enemy one time, once and for all, and then they're gone. Until like the next time when they creep up slowly but surely. But it's not an idea that can be in anyone who looks and acts like you. It's in these very clearly different creatures that we can exterminate without feeling bad about it at all. And just like you guys were talking about Bilbo's wealth and how it's like kind of ambiguous, it's like he always has the perfect amount of wealth, which is it's never going to run out, but he also is not extravagant. He doesn't have any kind of like gold things. He just has a lot of knickknacks. You
Right.
could be a billionaire hobbit as long as all your wealth is in knickknacks and they don't seem like you're just being extravagant and eccentric or anything. Like as long as you just have enough things that the Sackville Baggins could sell off after they take all your shit, and they are the bad people, even though they still by definition have to have only knickknacks and even less of them because they're selling your shit. Like they can't ever be as rich as Bilbo was just by selling off his estate. So, but they're still more evil, just not by virtue of the wealth they possess, just their character.
Bilbo would never commandeer a sub and go to the bottom of the ocean.
Very topical.
But
You missed our more explicit references to that, Mike, I think.
Yeah, sorry. I had to restart my computer there. My bad.
no, it's cool. But I don't really have much to say about the third movie. I mean, I think we kind of were pretty explicit at the beginning is that the movie's good, okay, bad in terms of like their trajectory. And I know, you know, given our system, eventually these movies are all going to be remade because they only remake movies. They don't make anything new. Some point in the future, they're going to redo these. I really hope that they redo The Hobbit specifically and maybe do it better. I don't know how you could do it worse.
Yeah. My fear is that they'll do it worse though. I like I don't want them to touch the Lord of the Rings. I'll be honest with you. I don't want it.
I only want those films and whatnot remade under like a socialist economic system, like where we have like the arts are more enjoyed. But if we're like in another like further down later stage imperialist society, I don't want it. I don't want to know what the themes are going to be. It ain't going to be good.
Yeah.
The only thing I want from the Lord of the Rings, I think it's coming up on the 25th anniversary. There's like rumors I sometimes see online of like a newer, more scenes that have been cut from the originals that weren't like completely finished that they'll put into like an even
like the Schneider cut kind of version.
Yeah, like a super extended edition where like the movie goes from 3 hours 20 to like I don't know, whatever, you know, and I'll be fine. I would be okay with that. I also would hate to see a remake of the Lord of the Rings. That would just be sad.
See, one thing that like I think some people would want to see, but I don't want to see, is Sauron coming out and fighting Aragorn at the Black Gate, because that is something that they actually toyed with, and I think that defeats the whole fucking purpose of the whole message of the movies.
Wait, didn't they film that?
They did.
Yeah.
And then they turned Sauron into a troll, which I think is the correct move, because it's not about like this final showdown between like the king and Aragorn,
Soon to be king.
or yeah, right, exactly,
Heir apparent.
right. So I don't know. I know we're getting far afield from the Hobbit at that point, but like it's just like, but it gets to the point of like what capitalism is doing to the things that we love and what it wants to do to the things that we love.
It's really sad, but the best you could hope for at this stage would be a series of the remake of Lord of the Rings, because it seems to be that whatever the way that the budgetary decisions are made between Hollywood movies and then like streaming series, the money goes to the series as far as like quality productions. Whereas like you were saying, Evan, it's only remakes going into the theaters now. So you can hope for a Lord of the Rings remake of the movies now into a series, and hope that they will cover all the material. I'll get a Tom Bombadil episode finally.
I was gonna say, where's the Tom Bombadil?
But like, it still won't be what you would hope, because it will never be like up to Peter Jackson's originals back in the 2000s for, nostalgia reasons, of course, but also just legit reasons, because they will shoehorn in things that don't belong there. They will bring in topical references. They'll try to appeal to too many audiences at once, and it won't work. All the same things that are wrong with these, when it just feels like, it feels smarmy and it feels saccharine. It's just not right.
Yeah.
And that's sad. I agree with you, Rye. I agree. You have to do it under a different kind of, what do you call it? Like determining of the profits of the production, or else it's just not going to come out the right way, because it doesn't work as a cash grab. You have to actually have the passion for it. That's why, like, I legit get sad that there is a time where it will be like the last time I see the Lord of the Rings movies. Like, I don't know when that will be, but like sometime in my life, it will be the last time that I view those movies. And every time I watch them, I'm like, that's like a thought in the back of my mind, because it's just so good. Like, all three of them are so great and they're so pure, because I feel like he was able to just do that. Like, he got all the money at once. He was able to make all three of the movies and just do it the way he wanted without anybody bothering him. And you can't do that anymore. And neither him nor anyone else will be able to approach it with that kind of vision.
Yeah.
I think go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, like, really quickly, you need a new superstructure in which to develop these things.
Yeah.
Not just the base.
I think that if Peter Jackson was brought in originally to just make the Hobbit movies, they're like, okay, you did the first 3 Lord of the Rings, forget Del Toro, you're going to be the one they brought in. I think these movies would have been different. I think that there was just, who knows what happened behind the scenes, because I think he had to do with what he was given in some sense, and they rewrote some of the script, supposedly. They reworked things. They had to save money. That's why they had to do the stupid CGI nonsense for everything. So this is into the weeds, but everyone should read The Hobbit. This is one of those few times at the end of the episode where I'm going to say, do you really need to see the movies?
Oh, no.
I mean, no.
Just the first one. And then read the books.
Or you only ever need to watch them once, and you don't need to touch the extended editions, but once may be enough. The books, you're going to get a lot more of an impactful experience when it comes to a lot of characters.
Yeah.
I think. They're a lot more likable.
I mean, you could probably read a synopsis, read the IMDb synopsis. Like, you'll get just as much out of it, like, other than a bunch of green screen special effects for at least the last 2.
And I didn't mention this too, is they filmed these movies at like a higher frame rate, which is why the first one was the first time it ever been done, which is why I feel like it seems so weird in sort of the way it looks.
I remember seeing that, because I think they did it in like 60 FPS, which is like, typically it's like 30, and it just looks too real.
Yep.
Like it feels like you're on the mountain when you shouldn't be there. You know, you're watching this to be immersed in it, but like, I don't want to be this immersed. And like 60 FPS is just like, it throws off. And in a way, it feels like they want you to like be more immersed, but it feels like it's just like, it's too much.
Yeah, because I think they were gonna because they also filmed them in 3D as well, which I think
Oh, okay.
was part of it. And they apparently fixed it for the second two. The second two aren't as bad, but the first one is really. I know what you're like has this weird thing, but I don't really have any. I don't know. Anyone have any last? We've last thoughts on the movies, the book, recommendations for content. I know I just got those David Day, that collection. I haven't read too much. I've looked through the Atlas. There's this little set that has some good historical context to all the different species. That's pretty cool for anyone who wants to get into that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to do the Rings of Power at some point, but we should figure out a way to do that. That might be a multi-episode thing, I think.
Yeah, I think it might be like you cover a couple episodes per episode.
Yeah. I mean, my message with this whole thing is that, like, and I mentioned it earlier, is I see a lot of like the right grabbing this shit because it like kind of represents like this pure European thing. And it's like, no, like this belongs to all of us. I'm not going to fucking cede this ground to this, which is why I'm so willing to put this out on my left-wing podcast, my communist podcast, because like, I'm not giving this shit up to the right. And there's still a lot to be, you know, wrestled with and gained from in terms of just like how humanity can behave and how we can be better from this shit. And I'm just not going to cede any ground to these motherfuckers that want to take these things that I love from me.
Truth.
Hell yeah.
Well, I don't feel like I feel like we've. You have any last thoughts, Ryan?
We should just do a live stream of playing the Lord of the Rings Magic the Gathering set. It comes out tomorrow. They have Goldberry, and she looks scrumdiddlyumptious. And Tom Bombadil. I'm just saying, you should play Magic. We should all play together.
So can we print our own Magic cards though, so I don't have to pay fucking Wizards of the Coast like $500 for a new pack?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm still holding out hope. I think that actually is a good thing. Like you're saying, Nick, and like you guys are, like you're saying, Rye. I'm holding out hope for like fan fiction remakes of Lord of the Rings content, because I think that's probably the way to go. Whether it takes the form of a game or it actually is some kind of online content, but maybe with God forbid AI making things easier as far as like at least production quality goes. Maybe more people will just be able to make this kind of stuff in their own rooms. And hopefully it happens in a collective way where it's people working together and feeding off each other and taking the actual spirit of the Lord of the Rings content. And yeah, the only thing that would make me paranoid in that situation would be that the right would take hold of it more just easily because it kind of leans in their direction. And so I can imagine like a bunch of 1488 nerds in a forum making a whole bunch of Lord of the Rings content because they really like it. Whereas left-wing people are just like, we don't need that old white dude shit. We can like find some other literature that we're going to create a universe around. So I could see it going either way. I would hope that Lord of the Rings content gets made by some hardcore fans with good politics. I would like to see that happening in the future.
Maybe we can push the Means TV streaming service to do it. That's like
Oh,
a
damn.
leftist streaming service.
That'd be cool.
They can definitely do it. I just don't know if they have the budget.
Yeah, you'd have to do it in a way that would be
You
cheaper,
can buy, like,
but
the rights and shit.
yeah.
Maybe.
I don't know. I think also there should be Marxist Tolkien just literature that doesn't really exist for the most part either.
Yeah.
To pry that away from the right, you could say like, look, here's this content.
It would be interesting to like rewrite the history of Middle Earth in terms of a class conflict, because it's there. It's just not how Tolkien's looking at it, but it still exists.
Well, I got nothing left. We'll bring you Rings of the Power in the future. Perhaps before the second season comes out. I don't know when that is. I think it's next year. But
Thanks for having us, Evan. This was fun, man.
Yeah, thank you
Nick,
so much.
Nick from Intervention, Mike, Turn Leftist, and Rye. Thanks for sticking around for ours to bring the leftist Tolkien universe to the people.
Hell yeah.
Absolutely. Anytime, man.
Thank you.
Of course. You can all listen, follow, subscribe to Nick and Mike's podcast and get all the other links in the place where the links go. And we'll catch you next time.
Say it.
Later.